when they did the 14th Amendment, what they were trying to do was overturn the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott said that the Supreme Court in Dred Scott said Dred Scott wasn't a citizen because he was black, he couldn't sue, and Lincoln rejected that. And so what they wanted to say is, wait a minute, no, you're a citizen, regardless of race, and we're going to correct that injustice. That was the purpose of it. It was.
Old pirates, yes, they rob I, sold I to the merchant ship. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit.
We began this episode with a June 30th clip of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis responding to the United States Supreme Court decision that Donald Trump's executive order eviscerating the principle of birthright citizenship is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Now, Neil and I, after a lot of research, have gotten into the complexities of that, but we'll address that after the news summary. But what's great about this clip, I think, is that in a bizarre feat of cognitive dissonance, at least on my part, DeSantis was at The Villages, an age-restricted adult community in Central Florida, unveiling a statue of President Abraham Lincoln as he was dissing the 14th Amendment. Okay. Neil, how you doing in the heat wave?
I'm good. I'm trying to stay cool and, refreshed and hydrated.
Well, you and I were just talking about it before we got on, that you don't get in the swimming pool. I have to tell you, I spent all day Tuesday, well, not all day, but from 4 o'clock till about 6 o'clock, floating in a friend's swimming pool. And it was just absolutely the perfect way to deal with it.
I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was a competitive swimmer growing up. So I have a bit
You
of a...
were?
Yeah, I have a complicated relationship with pools. So I do love to float, though. And I do think I was a fish in a former life, which is partly why I was a swimmer and all that. But yeah.
I think you were. Yeah.
I'm scared of the sun, though. So that's the biggest thing. I just stay out of the sun. And, that's kind of an issue if you're in the pool.
Well, you are right to be scared of the sun. And, I think you and Scarlett O'Hara, peaches and cream complexion, and you'll keep it forever. Yes. All right.
Would she have a 16-inch waist or something?
I think so, but it took a lot of effort.
Yes. Wow.
And I lost my 16-inch waist, I think, when I was 13 or so. I don't know about you. Okay, my friend, let's start with the news summary. It was a big week at the Supreme Court, part of which is going to be our news focus for today. But in addition to the birthright citizenship case, the court declined to take Donald Trump's appeal of the verdict in the E. Jean Carroll sexual abuse case. And what has happened subsequent to that, Neil?
Well, Carroll's attorneys have told the judge, or asked the judge rather, to release the damages, which were $5 million in damages. That's now at $5.8 million. So I think, that's something that'll be interesting to see, again, what Trump's side does on this. But big defeat for him. It's sort of wild that this was before the Supreme Court, or am I wrong about that?
It was before the Supreme Court because Donald Trump took the case to the court as a question of executive privilege. And what his lawyers were claiming is that you cannot sue the president.
Right.
But as the Supreme Court pointed out, and they simply declined to take the case, basically, but they waited till the end of the term to do that. As they pointed out, he wasn't president when he was being sued by E. Jean Carroll, which I guess Trump would beg to differ because he thinks he was actually elected in 2020. So, but it also, there's an object lesson here about not paying your bills, because $5 million turns into $5.8 million very quickly. There's also about, $50 or $60 million worth of damages in which he was fined by the court for defaming her after the verdict, right?
Right.
And nobody's mentioning that. But I've actually met E. Jean Carroll. She's an amazing and very strong woman, and also very, very funny. And she's just sticking with it. And as she said, at the book party that I met her at, I'm 83 years old. What else am I going to do? Okay, so we're going to provide a summary of the full term by 3 experts, listeners. And these experts basically say the court, the majority in the court, the conservative majority, has created greater openings for presidential power and the unitary executive that the Republicans are so fond of. But Neil and I want to talk about another decision, which is the court upholding state bans on transgender girls and women participating in sports designated for women. And here it seems like it was a kind of Solomonic decision and they split the baby, right, Neil?
Well, first of all, yes, I think that that's right. But just back to the summary from the New York Times, I think that's worth folks reading. And
Sure.
one of the things that they point out before we get into this that I thought was interesting was that, a lot of these votes are coming down 6-3, not surprising given the court's makeup. But the sort of unusual situation before the court right now is they are looking at case after case brought by this president because he is such a litigious is using the courts or trying to use the courts to advance not only his agenda, but really his own sort of personal agenda, not just in addition to his political agenda, but that in so many of those cases that have been originated by the president, the 6-3 or 5-4 votes go against him. So actually the three justices that he's appointed tend to be the ones that have voted against him, his own sort of cases the cases that have originated from him. So it's sort of an interesting analysis there. But back to the state bans on transgender girls and women, I don't think this was a surprising decision at all, Claire, right? And I think the point about splitting the baby is that I guess one way that would be the case is this is just upholding it in state bans, but it's not a 50-state application.
Exactly. So what the court said was that transgender people cannot sue under Title IX because they are not included in Title IX. But that also means Title IX can't be used against them either. And that is what some of these activists have tried to do, is to say that there is discrimination against women by what they call winningly biological men. So they can't use Title IX for that. They have upheld the bans in the states where legislatures have taken action, but it looks like the states that have managed to hold out and fight these bans are in the clear, at least for now. What's really tricky about this, Neil, is that it's not altogether clear how you enforce this without actually abusing women and girls. And, how, in fact, and we've seen cases of parents sort of pointing at a girl who's doing particularly well on the soccer field and saying, I think she's a boy, we want her to be examined. And this is not unprecedented. I went to school with somebody at Yale who was an Olympic rower, a woman named Chris Ernst, who was the bow seat of an Olympic gold medal crew team, Crew 8, and she was constantly being genetically tested. And it was because she was very small, but very wiry, very strong, and very boyish. And so she was just constantly being pestered to have genetic material taken. It's also unclear, even if certain kinds of testing, and some states have said a child could be examined by a gynecologist to see what her genitalia is, which is just horrifying. It's also unclear where genetic testing or even hormone testing leaves a range of people who are born and remain women and girls, because hormonal levels are so variable. Within that, as are testosterone levels in boys and girls. So the other thing is, it's not clear where this leaves transgender boys. The focus is always on women and girls, but few of these laws, there's only 2 states, I think Idaho is one, maybe West Virginia is another. There's only 2 of these states that explicitly say that transgender boys cannot compete on men's teams. So the whole emphasis has been on, do you want your little girl to be pushed around and hurt by a big, burly transgender girl?
Yeah.
But So I think there's more litigation coming down the line because discriminating against transgender girls and transgender boys seems odd to me. And I would like to say, in the middle of all of this, the first transgender man rode at Henley this week, the Henley Royal Regatta in England, which is like the biggest and most prestigious regatta in the world. There was a transgender boy in a men's four. And the English apparently have no problem with this. So I think while this is a disappointing outcome for young athletes, the scant few of them that there are, I think this is not over and that there will be another stage of litigation in all of this.
Yeah, and I think the decision, as you say, allows a lot of future legal battles. One, I mean, you're speaking about the enforcement challenge, and I think, one of the things that I wonder about in upholding these two state bans, I mean, maybe this is not as true on the high school level, but what does this mean for collegiate sports? I mean, a team from Idaho or West Virginia, a collegiate team, spends half of its time traveling to other states to play teams or hosting teams from other states. And so I think that you can just sort of imagine multiple fronts upon which future litigants can make cases. Right. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, and of course, the Olympics have already said they will test women. But they're not going to test men, but they are going to test all women. And I think the NCAA has taken action in some cases. One of the other things that was interesting about this case is both of the complainants dropped out. One saying she just wasn't interested in pursuing it anymore. The other one had actually already graduated. So it was a case in which it was really about the broader question and not an individual right. I just want to throw one other thing in for our listeners who have probably heard a lot of people say that, the reason this is really unfair to women and girls is that athletic scholarships are at stake. And this is a principle that was established ages ago by Birch Bayh when he expanded Title IX to include equality in athletics, and saying that any school that took federal funding had to devote equal resources to men and women. It is, however, a fallacy that large numbers of women and girls are going to school for free on athletic scholarships. Something like 2% of high school athletes ever win an athletic scholarship.
Sure. Yeah.
So there is really not a lot of money at stake here. There are not a lot of athletes involved, and to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever been hurt. Okay, so let's turn to electoral politics. Colorado had its primary this week. The very well-funded Michael Bennet will return to the Senate. Apparently, you don't have to resign your Senate seat to run for governor in Colorado after State Attorney General Phil Weiser just destroyed him by 13 points. The Republican ballot line is still too close to call as Barb Kirkmeyer and Victor March duke it out vote by vote. But what is there to be learned from the Colorado race, Neil?
Well, I thought it was interesting in the Bennett-Weiser race that a lot of the folk, well, first of all, I do think that Weiser was able to sort of use an anti-establishment, anti-billionaire argument. I mean, he's kind of the establishment too as a state attorney general, but it sounded like a lot of folks who were interviewed were saying things like, we just think Bennett is a really good senator, and so he needs to stay in Washington, D.C. and continue the work there. So it wasn't really a rejection of him as much as they were like, no, just keep doing that thing and we'll let someone else be governor. I thought that sort of was interesting to me.
Yeah, full disclosure, Michael Bennet is the son of Douglas Bennett, who was the president of Wesleyan University and somebody of whom I was extremely fond.
I didn't realize that connection.
Yeah, I loved Doug Bennett. And Doug was actually the guy that made NPR independent of federal funding. He sort of saw the tea leaves and read them correctly and raised a lot of money, which meant that NPR was not harmed by the Trump administration cuts the way the television branch of public media was. But the other thing about Michael Bennet is apparently Democrats were saying, well, he hasn't fought Trump enough, and that his fairly low-key, relatively studious personality, his lack of a social media presence and so on, made people think he wasn't a fighter. And that's beginning to emerge in some of these elections. Like, who's going to get in there and really fight the Republicans? And obviously an attorney general has a documented record of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say, well, that's maybe not a funny thing, but maybe a sort of, not the sort of thing that one would normally evaluate as like a core requirement for someone who's running to be governor, right?
Right.
You think of
Right.
sort of managerial and operational,
Right.
although we also know that governors have played a role in standing up to this administration in the ways that they've tried to, interfere in state
Right.
and, how states operate. So it's not necessarily inconsequential right now, but it does seem
Right.
like not the way that governor candidates for governorships have normally been evaluated.
Yeah, and there was so much of a gap between the two of them. It's hard to say if there was anything that might have changed this. I do sometimes wonder if Jared Polis letting that nasty little piece of work, election denier, out of jail sort of riled up the electorate and said, we don't want somebody who's going to do that kind of thing again. And they sort of pinned it on Michael Bennet that as a reasonable, nice guy, he might. But people in Denver swung way left. Democratic Socialists of America seem to still be on a roll. Melat Kiros, a lawyer and a PhD candidate, second PhD candidate to win a primary with
There are
Democratic
no jobs in
Socialists.
academia, so you have to run for
I
office.
know.
This is what
I
happens.
know. I'm so pleased about this. Okay, well, she was in public policy at UC Denver, and she toppled a 68-year-old progressive incumbent, Diana DiGetti. Israel appears to be an issue, as it tends to be nowadays, but there's also other kinds of discontent among Democratic voters that got them behind Kiros. What was that about, Neil?
Well, I think a lot of this is anti-establishment
Yep.
fervor. I mean,
Yep.
DiGetti was almost 3 decades in Congress, so, I think it's easy to sort of mobilize that argument against someone like that. Again, I think, it's a question how much these DSA victories are very particular to the locations and how much they are sort of foreshadowing of what's to come or, a sign of broader transformation. I think the jury's still out on this. I think, winning, this is another, win in a large city. And I do think the issue, obviously, of Israel the issue of Israel apparently was critical in this particular race. And also, I don't know what the turnout was. Like, I didn't look into that. So I don't know if this is something where, like, numbers were low to begin with. And in that scenario, I think an upset or a tumbling of a incumbent becomes more likely.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also wonder if the sheer question of age is beginning to get through to the electorate. That, 68, well, I'm 68, but should someone who's 68 really be in Congress? I don't think somebody who's 68 should be in the classroom, frankly, and it's one of the reasons I retired. So I think the question of whether younger candidates are drawing young people who themselves feel disenfranchised in the current situation, whether that's an issue too. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I would vote for you, Claire, at any age. But I do think, yes, I think it's part about that, like which candidates are mobilizing and energizing folks to come out. It also just underscores something that, like, the Democratic Party has said it needed to reckon with for quite some time, which is its aging political class, and yet hasn't done so. So the voters may do it for them if the party management doesn't.
And it's interesting because, of course, the same demographic is head over heels in love with Bernie Sanders and thinks he's never going to die. So it's not as if they're applying the same standard to everyone. So let's shift to Texas for a second here. We're going to drop in and out of Texas until this election happens. But there have been a series of anti-Ken Paxton ads which feature the Texas GOP's choice for the Senate's moral failings as a husband, presumably attempting to heighten the contrast with Democrat James Tallarico, who is a devout Christian and to all appearances a socially proper person. This week, Tallarico himself distributed a story from the Daily Mail about Paxton on his own social media. Neil, can you tell our listeners about that story?
Well, it's that, Paxton, who isn't officially divorced yet, he appears to have gone on a trip to Iceland with a woman who is not his wife, but it's a different woman from the one who apparently, precipitated the marital split. So, Paxton is popular apparently with the ladies and has no hesitation about being out in public with whoever the latest one. Did you see the video of him caught in Iceland where he sort of backs away from? I mean, it's just like, just go live your life, dude. Like, go, but like, don't. I mean, I guess I would say don't run for Senate, but I guess that's the question here. Is this actually going to be held against him?
Okay, so I have two questions. One is, why is Ken Paxton in Iceland and not campaigning? That strikes me as actually kind of strange. It's not as...
It's tied. Yeah. The race is tied right now. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be in Texas in July either, although it does seem like he better get his butt back to the US of A for the July 4th celebration.
Right.
He's a good old red American Texan, but maybe he's got a return ticket booked.
Right. I mean, there are rodeos to go to, there are fairs to go to, there are churches to speak at. Texas is a huge state. It's very, very difficult to campaign in Texas, as I've said before. And I am convinced of this because of having read all of Robert Caro's books about Lyndon Johnson and seeing him describe what it's like to campaign in Texas. Well, the state hasn't gotten any smaller since then. But the other thing I wonder about, and I'd really love your wisdom on this, Neil, is it effective to focus on Ken Paxton's morality as opposed to 20 years of corruption?
It's a really good question. I don't know, because I think on one hand, you could say, well, nobody cares about corruption anymore because of who's the president.
Right.
But you could also say no one cares about marital infidelity anymore because of who the president is. And by no one, I mean Republicans specifically.
Right.
So I think obviously these ads are probably not really about convincing Republicans in Texas to vote for Tallarico, although I do think they can help toward sort of suppressing the vote and, undermining voter interest and actually getting out and supporting Paxton, which, is significant when a race is tied. I think it seems like the vote to get in Texas are independents. And I don't know if stressing the moral failings of this man would be as effective with those voters as presenting him as thoroughly corrupt, which the record shows he is. It seems like, independent voters in the suburbs might give him some leeway on these, personal infidelities, but to really point out how corrupt he is might be something that would sway those sorts of voters who don't want to put up with this from either party.
Right. And the other thing I think about is the Republican attack on Tallarico has been, he's not manly enough. What kind of a man is this? And it seems to me that there's a healthy chunk of the electorate that either in their hearts or right on the surface think that men who screw around are studs. And so I wonder if actually foregrounding that is a really good idea. I would also add to that certainly on the Democratic side, not just Graham Plattner, but if we sort of spin backward in time to Bill Clinton, I would honestly have to say, while his various infidelities troubled me, what troubled me more was that he lied about them. And yet I voted for him twice. So it's not clear to me that this is something that voters really have top of mind when they're making a decision.
Yeah, I don't think they do. I think there's a whole mountain of evidence that shows they don't. I do think it's worth pointing out that, the party that made these issues sort of paramount, or at least weaponized them for great political gain during, much of the period that you just talked about, is putting forward candidates who make Bill Clinton look like a choir boy in so many ways and seem to be relishing, again, like you said, relishing that sort of bravura and that sort of, this is the form of masculinity that appears to have captivated and energized so much of the Republican base.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the bigger picture. A new Times Siena poll has revealed that Republicans are really now in a dogfight to hang on to the governor's mansions in two red states, Iowa and Ohio. Ohio, I'm thinking, might be kind of a bellwether state for 2028. What do you think, Neil?
I think so. We've been sort of touching on this for a couple of weeks or months now, because this, again, what we thought looked like a thoroughly red state in the last couple of years, and one that was moving sort of in a redder direction, all of a sudden seems purplish again.
Yeah.
So all eyes on Ohio as Florida moves, permanently into the red state camp. But Ohio seems to be just a battleground again in a way that I don't think folks expected it to be.
Well, and of course, we have seen in the past 6 years Wisconsin getting clawed back from a sort of purpley red status and becoming more properly blue again. But we've got two races in Ohio that are pretty interesting. One is Republican Senator, who is the incumbent, John Husted, leading former Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. Great name recognition because Brown served multiple terms in the Senate before he was toppled. Husted is only leading by 3 points, which is within the realm of error, although Nate Cohn this morning said he thinks that race is a little tougher for Sherrod Brown than everybody's saying. But the other race that's really interesting is tech bro Vivek Ramaswamy, who is the Republican candidate for governor, running against physician Amy Acton, who is a public health physician. They're in a dead heat for the governor's mansion. Acton is actually up by 3 points, again within the margin of error. So what do we think is going on in Ohio, Neil?
I think there's a very good chance we're going to see split tickets here. I think Husted will win. I think Sherrod Brown's numbers are higher than the actual pan out. Although I think I mentioned I was in Ohio a couple of weeks ago visiting my in-laws, and I saw Sherrod Brown signs everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I'm predicting now, Husted wins re-election to the Senate. Amy Acton wins the governorship. And I do not think Vivek Ramaswamy should be the governor of Ohio. I think he's a sort of, I really do not care for him for many reasons. But I do think there's a good chance that the reason he's not doing as well there is because of racism. And I think we have to sort of factor that in. And I imagine that there's enough of a sort of electorate there that will be motivated by such things that it might lead to sort of split ticket results in Ohio.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wish I could disagree with you, and then we could have like some kind of complicated bet that pays off in November and keep all our listeners hanging. But I agree with you. I think that's what's going to happen. The other thing about Vivek Ramaswamy is he's really not MAGA. He has sort of split with MAGA in any number of ways. Remember the whole thing where Ramaswamy and Elon Musk were supposed to run Doge together?
Right.
And then Ramaswamy left, and all of the inside information was that everybody in Doge hated him. Well, he's not a really likable person. He's sort of physically peculiar. He has a lot of views that depart radically from MAGA. He played sort of a role of chiding the Trump administration for doing things wrong. I think a lot of that is going to come up. I just don't see him motivating Republican voters to vote for him. And I can see a lot of Republican voters actually leaving the governor's line blank. Not even split ticketing, just leaving it blank. MAGA really does not like people of Indian descent, like a lot, because a lot of these people who are now adults are the children of highly educated people, and we're going to be talking about this in our next segment, highly educated people who came in on the 1965 Act that prioritized very educated, skilled professionals. And that's when a lot of Indians came to the United States. It's when Kamala Harris's mother came to the United States during that period, as well as her father from Africa. So he is the kind of person that MAGA loves to hate, the person who is taking some white boy's job.
Yeah. I think he's not a very likable sort of public figure. There's
Right.
just something sort of, I don't know, it just doesn't give off a sort of a likability, charisma type thing. He has sort of I think he has sort of his own sort of independence in a lot of ways around his views, which in some ways is nice to see, that he's not a total MAGA, walking in lockstep. So it's been interesting to see some of these town hall Q&As he does and it seems like young folks really don't like him in the state, which is, a problem. And so you see some young folks at these town halls that are giving him a hard time because he's not a hardliner,
Right.
in opposition to H-1B visas, for example.
Right.
So he's getting it on that issue. And then on a very different issue, he's being attacked on his full-throated support for Israel, which is this other sort of interesting development within the Republican Party. So it seems like there's sort of multiple angles upon which his support could be weakened, and I think that that's the case. I mean, I spoke about seeing all the Sherrod Brown signs all over Ohio when we were there a few weeks ago. We actually drove across the state, so I saw a lot of it. I saw one Ramaswamy sign the entire time I was in Ohio, and it was when we were in the wealthiest neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, and it was in front of this huge mansion. And I thought, so maybe he has the country club Republican voter locked in, but that's not how you win an election in Ohio.
Yeah, I think, where Sherrod Brown may be able to strike against John Husted is that under Biden, there were factories that were reopened in Ohio. There were factories that did not move because Biden took action. And Sherrod Brown, at least for the first couple of years of the Biden administration, was, he was basically out as a senator, but the Democrats were in there kicking and trying to put people back to work in Ohio. Under the Trump administration, that and every other effort to put people back to work and reopen factories and so on has just gone fallow. And so if Sherrod Brown, who sort of reads as a working class guy, even though he isn't, he walks around with his sleeves rolled up, he's really hairy, he doesn't wear a tie, blah, blah, blah. If he can activate those voters who are generationally underemployed because of oligarchic policies, I think he's got a chance. But who knows? Who knows? All right. So let's turn to birthright citizenship, Neil. And let's start with a question that I think our listeners are probably just as puzzled about as we were. And we talked about it before the show that we both had to do a little research. The Supreme Court upheld the principle of birthright citizenship in a case called Trump v. Barbera, which was a suit against the Trump administration because of Donald Trump's January 20th executive order in which he said birthright citizenship is no more. Okay. But both you and I were seeing, on the one hand, that the vote was 6-3, and on the other hand, that the vote was 5-4, and we figured it out. Can you tell our listeners why, in fact, there are two ways of viewing this victory? One as a solid victory, and the other as a really marginal victory.
Yeah, I mean, it was a quite confusing couple of minutes when I was scrolling through all the different articles right as the news dropped, and some of them were saying 5-4, some were saying 6-3. I'm like, what is it? And who are the votes on which side of each? So there's two different decisions here, and one is about one is a statutory decision, and on that, that's where we have the 6-3 vote. On the constitutional question, we have a 5-4 vote, and I think, both are, wins for the 14th Amendment, but one's a very slim win. And I think folks are finding a lot of concern about the fact that the constitutional question, only had a 5-4 decision.
Right. And let's dig in a little bit, because the statutory decision, which is actually appalling that there were 3 justices that dissented from this. The statutory decision was that the president cannot make an executive order that overrules the Constitution.
Yeah.
So and that really is a question that would gut the court system. If that were the case, that would really push all political power into the president's office, which I think might have been part of the point of this executive order. And I think you mentioned earlier, Neil, that there has been this sort of flood of cases put forward by Trump and also against Trump. And I think some of these things they do just to sort of push the constitutional question and see where they can get. Okay, so the statutory question is no, the president cannot make an executive order that contradicts the Constitution. But the constitutional question, and this is something that Brett Kavanaugh is really sort of the flip vote here, and we can talk about that a little bit. The constitutional question is, does the citizenship clause protect the children of people who are temporarily or illegally in the United States? And this is the propaganda, of course, of the Republican Party, at least those of them that are on X and other forms of social media have been hitting hard. You know, can someone just walk into the United States, have a baby, have that baby be an American citizen, and then have that child be able to file for citizenship for the parents and every other relative under family reunification, which we can talk about a little bit later. Okay, so that is, we don't know how often it happens that people who are temporarily or illegally in the United States have a child on the theory that they will use that child. And the phrase for it, something that Jeb Bush made up, which again we should talk about in a minute, is anchor baby, right? So what Brett Kavanaugh said was the Constitution is clear that people born legally in the United States, or parents who are legally here, say on H-1B visas,
Right.
okay, that their child is absolutely a citizen. But does the citizenship clause protect the children of people who are temporarily or legal in the United States? Brett Kavanaugh says he's not so sure about that, and actually Congress needs to go to work and create legislation around that. Can you talk a little bit about where Amy Coney Barrett and Kavanaugh fit in this sort of peculiar question? Where did everybody fit? I mean, it was a crazy decision.
Right. So on the 6-3 vote, it was Chief Justice Roberts, Coney Barrett, and Kavanaugh on the 6-3 statutory decision, right? It was Kavanaugh, Chief Justice Roberts, and Coney Barrett, and then Kavanaugh broke off. But he wrote his own dissent, right? Like that was his own single standing dissent in the in that argument that you just made, which was different from the ones that like Clarence Thomas and the others wrote. I mean, I think Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett have been really interesting in sort of being like, they're the ones who kind of vote. I mean, are they the swing voters of this court? I think so.
Yeah.
Coney Barrett more so than Kavanaugh. I mean, it's interesting that you said Kavanaugh sort of like the Constitution isn't clear when the language of the 14th Amendment is all persons born.
Right.
And I don't know if this is the time to talk about like constitutional like interpretive frameworks, but I do hope we get a moment at some point, either now or later, to like just completely skewer textualism and originalism.
Right. Well, you know, this is where history comes in, you know, and I was thinking, Neil, you said earlier, you know, there are no jobs in history, or in academia, so why shouldn't people run for elected office? I began to think that actually universities need to start reinvesting in those degrees they used to have where you could get a PhD and a JD at the same time. Mm-hmm. And particularly history, because the history in this case is wildly all over the place. And I mean, Clarence Thomas wrote a 91-page dissent in which he gets almost all of the history wrong. Alito and Gorsuch wrote dissents in which they get the history wrong. Associate Justice Jackson wrote a concurrence rebuking Clarence Thomas for his dissent. And then Kavanaugh's concurrence seems to make a historical error in exactly the way you're saying. So, and the history here, and just to go back to the clip we opened with, in which Ron DeSantis is saying, you know, this is really about slavery. Okay, this is the Republican story, that the only reason we have the 14th Amendment is to correct Dred Scott, which they are saying was an error of the court. Well, I think it was an error of the court too, but when they say that, they're actually attacking the institution of the Supreme Court. And yes, Dred Scott was one thing, but it is also true that from about 1963 on, Southerners who had property in souls were shipping them to South America. They were marching them to Mexico or to Texas to then stage them for being sold in Mexico, for being sold in other countries in Latin America where slavery was still legal. And then there was a whole group of people in the United States after the Civil War who believed that the best solution to freeing people was to send them back to Africa, to recolonize Africa with people who had been born in the United States. So it was a clause that not only sought to establish citizenship of people who had more than earned it, but also it was extended to Native American people. Because the question is, what are we to do with the citizenship of Native American people? So this capacious clause to the 14th Amendment was written to establish the fact that people of color were human beings and were the equal of white people, which fundamentally many Republican people do not believe. They do not, in fact, believe that people of color are the equal of white people. And I know that's a nasty and controversial thing to say, and they deny it all the time. But in fact, so much of what they do indicates that they do, in fact, believe that. So where is the history that allows us to say this is a nothing burger? This is a non-question.
Meaning how to interpret this, what seems very plain text. I mean, I want to pull out, I'm not sure this is the way that you anticipate this being answered, but I really want to pull out to sort of a bigger lens of analysis here, which is sort of the history of conservative legal activism, which has pursued two different tracks, one being textualism and one being originalism. So you have folks who say that they are constitutional textualists, meaning that they believe in sort of a literal interpretation of the Constitution. You just read the text and you interpret it, and that's what the answer is. But of course, they aren't always textualists, because sometimes being a textualist gets you not the outcome that you want. It doesn't work really well when you want to look at the Second Amendment, because right there, a well-regulated militia. It really doesn't work here when it says all persons born. I mean, what other way is there to interpret this text than what it says exactly there? So as we saw the other day, everyone became an originalist. All of the argument was about the intent of those who wrote it at the time, and the intent was very plainly connected to the one particular scenario of enslaved persons, post-Civil War, Dred Scott, yada, yada, yada. But, to be a textualist who becomes an originalist shows that you're neither, because from moving from one to the other contradicts each one. And so I think that's fine. As a person who believes in a living constitution, and you should interpret it sort of maybe driven more by pragmatism or the needs of the moment, whatever. But conservatives are so devoted to this sort of pure commitment to one sort of philosophical or one sort of legal interpretation, and yet they show that they aren't over and over again. So I don't know if that's necessarily the history that you think is most relevant here, but I do think it's important to sort of think about conservative legal strategy, how they've been deployed historically, and the inconsistency that's sort of inherent in that approach.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. And of course, what it would have taken for the administration to win in Trump v. Barbera is for the court to overturn an 1898 case, United States v. Wong Kim Ark. And one of the things that, the conservatives don't really want to talk about online when they're so focused about, how virtuously they protected the children of enslaved people and freed people and so on and so forth, is the history of discrimination against Asians in America, Asians who were often trafficked here to work under deplorable conditions, and against whom various laws were made. And I think California is a chief offender here, but I think other Western states were as well, where they actually stripped certain kinds of citizenship rights from Asian people because, as they asserted, Asian people were unassimilable. They could never become American, and they could never take on American values, and so on. And that lasts for a relatively long time. I mean, when in 1942, the federal government is rounding up Japanese people in California, there are many of those Japanese people who still do not own their own land. They've formed various forms of cooperatives and corporate arrangements in order to purchase land and work land. And in fact, many of those people get to keep their land because it is then put in trust with other people. But those laws last for a very long time. And there's another law that is also passed in the late 19th century that says that if a white woman marries an Asian man who is not a citizen, she loses her United States citizenship. So in 1898, Wong Kim Ark, who was Chinese, who was born in the United States and is stopped at the border and told, you are not an American, you can't come in. And he says, oh, yes, I am, under the 14th Amendment. And he sues and he wins. So that affirms the principle that Asian Americans whose parents might otherwise be barred from citizenship, but who were born in the United States, are entitled to 14th Amendment protection. I wonder if, in fact, the anti-immigration people are actually going to go after Wong Kim Ark and use that entry point that, well, your parents were not entitled to citizenship because they crossed into this country illegally. That's what I'm wondering.
Well, that could be one of the attack lanes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's also, folks in Congress saying that they're going to do stuff as well. So, right, the Constitution, like there needs to be a new law introduced, but like we need a new amendment. But like, there's no way that like the states are going to allow ratification, right?
No.
Of a new amendment. So like that's not.
No.
But like folks are, I mean, like Mike Lee from Utah is out there saying he's going to spearhead that effort. So
he's such a pig.
Yeah, that's right.
He's such a pig.
But like, so he's out there saying that, and I think that I can't tell if that's even just like political grandstanding or if we will see some of that movement in that direction.
Right.
But I think you're right about this sort of legal challenge to the 1898 case. I mean, that feels like you could see that really go somewhere.
Right. Well, and one of the things that happens after Wong Kim Ark is that, in fact, Congress motivates to begin to narrow the path to immigration completely. So you see all of these laws being passed in the 1920s. I think there's one in 22, one in 24, and one in 25 that stop immigration almost completely. And by the 1930s, we actually have negative immigration to the United States for a variety of reasons, but those laws are among them. And so it's those laws that begin to be reformed in 1952 with the McCarran-Walter Act. Part of what's interesting about McCarran-Walter is that some of the impetus behind it was the military service that Japanese and Chinese American men did for the United States during the war. And that act of citizenship then causes a great many people who want to eliminate these laws and help people immigrate say, this has turned out to be false. Of course, these are assimilable people. And of course, they have done yeoman service. But the big one is in 1965, as I mentioned earlier, the Hart-Celler Act, which completely eliminates the racist quota system and instead prioritizes highly skilled immigrants like Kamala Harris's parents. And it also, and this is the one the Republicans hate, it has a provision for family reunification. And that was one of the big problems of those years between the 1920s and World War II, is that it was almost impossible. Families were split, basically. They could not bring their family members to the United States. And so today, most Americans actually support birthright citizenship and support family reunification. But what Republicans will say is that it is exactly those babies born in the United States that are the plot, the Democratic plot to bring voters of color to the United States to vote for them. So how is Jeb Bush involved in all of this?
Well, I think you mentioned this a little bit already, but
Yeah.
when he was running for president in 2015, he had this idea. I mean, really, he promoted this myth of the anchor baby, right? This idea that folks are crossing the border, they're dropping, they're giving birth to a baby, and that this, person born on U.S. soil who's granted immediate American citizenship becomes the anchor by which, its extended family can then come into the country, which is not, of course, how this works at all.
Right.
But although Jeb Bush went nowhere in that presidential campaign, that was when he did the thing where he said, "Please clap."
Yes, Jeb, exclamation point.
That he was speaking to something that was really energizing and mobilizing the Republican electorate in the moment, which, obviously Trump capitalized on, and the sort of anti-immigration sentiment and that particular paranoia that I think we should just spell this out again, that this is the pathway by which Democrats, are able to retain or to have any sort of political power in the U.S., right? That the only way they can win elections is by importing and, breeding voters, because the white Americans aren't going to vote for the Democratic Party. So that is a notion that I think has moved from sort of the conspiratorial realm to mainstream Republican messaging in a really short amount of time.
Right. And so now Trump-aligned forces are elevating the idea of so-called birth tourism, that there are, and in fact, it is true that there are travel agencies that arrange for women to come to the United States to give birth. That does happen. It is not a very high percentage of people, but it is also a form of visa fraud. So it is already against the law to do that, to come to the United States just to give birth. But part of what I'm seeing on social media is, and I think the head of the Federalist Society put out this atrocious tweet in which he said, we need to stop letting any pregnant women into the United States at all. And if a woman wants to come to the United States, she should have to prove she is not pregnant. She should have to take a pregnancy test right at the border in order to get a visa to come here. So once again, the Republican Party has managed to show it's not just its grossly racist side, but its grossly misogynist side as well. But I would not put it past Donald Trump to put out an executive order saying no pregnant women are allowed to come to the United States and have weeks of confusion around that before there's an injunction.
Completely. And I mean, I saw that tweet as well. I'm blanking on his name. Sean something, the head of the
Sean
Federalist
something.
Society.
They're all named Sean. Yeah.
I want to say Sean Hayes, but I'm like, no, that's the guy in Will and Grace. Whoever. It was a really, he's a shocking person in general in terms of what he tweets on the regular basis, but this one was particularly abhorrent. And really to stipulate something like that, or to just sort of imagine something like that how would that take place? I mean, it's the policing of women's bodies or the actual subjugation of them to medical examination.
Right.
Is to, I think, just sort of, I don't know, is this like Handmaid's Tale part 4? Like which part are we on at this point?
Well, it most certainly is. And I would have to say it brings it together with the transgender case.
Yes.
Because the idea that you create an orderly society by invading women's bodies as a matter of policy seems to be a theme for these people. We can add Dobbs to that. We should be going to work for the Democratic Party and writing their policy papers, Neil. All right.
Stick
Well,
to my Hamptons book, but
right. I'll stick to Susan Brown Miller. Okay, so we're probably going to be coming back to this at some point because I doubt the Republicans are just going to let this drop, although they're in a tricky position at this point, messing with immigrant communities before the 2026 election. But we will be coming back to this, listeners, I promise. Neil, what do you want to go viral this week?
Okay, we're moving in a real different direction. And actually, this doesn't need
Good.
my help at all to be viral because it's sort of sitting very happily at the #1 spot on Netflix. But it's the newest season of America's Sweethearts, Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. Do you watch
Oh, I
this
love
show?
it. I love it. I love it. No, I have watched some of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, but I've not watched this season.
Okay.
But
so
I love them.
Season 3 just dropped.
Okay.
We watched it all in like 2 days. So this is it's had 3 seasons. It's a show, as you can tell, about the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, or DCC, as they like to say over and over again. And it's mostly focused. I didn't watch season 1, actually. My husband was watching it. He asked me if I wanted to watch it. I said, hell no, because it just felt like, do I want to watch a show about Dallas football? I mean, I love football. I love all the things, but it just didn't feel like the content I wanted to consume a couple
I hear
years ago, given like the moment we're in. He watched the first season by himself and then just like kept raving about it to me and asked me if I would please watch season 2 with him, which I did. And I was completely taken in. And so I don't know what season 1 was really about, but season 2 and season 3 really focus on like training camp when, the folks are auditioning to be on it, and then they get selected to go in this training camp, and it's usually like, I don't know, like 48 of them are narrowed down to 36 or whatever, and you get to, it's like a normal.
It's really hard to get to be one of these gals.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to speak about, because the athleticism and the dance talent and just the like the incredible sort of stuff they have to submit their bodies to is unbelievable. And they're always like showing these old clips, which I love, the vintage clips of, Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders through the years. But, I mean, no offense to the women in the 70s or 80s, but they were doing much different moves than these like basically Olympic athletes are doing. So that's one of the things I think is really interesting. There's sort of it's like not political, but of course there's a politics to it that I think is really sort of always this rich text of analysis, because like in general it feels very conservative. It's a lot of, I mean, it's Texas, it's Dallas, it's football, it's family, it's faith, it's all those things, but it never feels MAGA. And I think that might be a sort of producer decision because they want, this to be widely watched. But I also think it sort of speaks to the diversity of the team, although, it's primarily a white women team, but there is more diversity than I think a lot of folks would imagine. I don't know. I don't have like a big takeaway about this, but I think it's like really worth watching. I like it as there's been all this ink spilled about like MAGA and red meat content that Hollywood's going to put out, and they have been putting out post 2024, and I think there's some interesting things to think about there. But this feels like a way to sort of peer into a world that is certainly conservative and probably MAGA adjacent, but where the politics isn't the overwhelming way that they're driving in. I mean, they're pulling in viewers to sort of meet this moment as much as it just feels like turning the cameras on and allowing us to observe this really fascinating world. I don't know. I really think folks should watch it. And there's some really, really likable characters in it. Again, some incredible talent from these young women. The stuff they subject their bodies to is really just, you have to sort of admire them for just their commitment to their craft and all that. So I don't know. Watch it. It's a great binge.
Well, I did watch a reality show about a high school cheer team, and I can't remember what it was called, but it was absolutely fascinating. I rarely watch reality shows, and cheerleading is a sport now. I mean, it is a genuine sport. It used to be just pretty people, men and women, who were hopping around. And now it takes a tremendous amount of athletic ability, as you were saying. My question is, do the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders have a male cheerleader? Because some of the teams do now.
They do
and
not.
It's
not going to happen.
It is a fabulous platform for athletic gay men. I think the Vikings male cheerleader was particularly reviled by MAGA. Like, this is disgusting. They're this is an American sport, blah, blah, blah. But I actually think one of the things that's interesting about football cheerleading is it has changed with the times. I mean, when they first started doing it, the women weren't paid at all. And then they were paid very poorly, and they were responsible for their own hair and keeping up their own outfits. I mean, you paid money to be a cheerleader. It was considered an honor. But I would also have to say, I actually met a woman who was in her maybe 70s who was a former Atlanta Falcons cheerleader. And I met her in an airport, and she had just come from a reunion of the Atlanta Falcons cheerleaders. She was wearing a jeans jacket that was all bedazzled and everything. But her daughter was an Atlanta Falcons cheerleader, and her granddaughter was an Atlanta Falcons cheerleader. So it is a mother-daughter thing to do this as well. I actually think it's fascinating, and you have convinced me, and I'm going to watch it, Neil.
I could say so many more things, but I'll just say go watch it and let's talk more about it.
Maybe when football season comes, we'll devote a whole episode to cheerleading.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to do sports too, Neil, and I want everyone to read Louisa Thomas's piece, to which I will link. Serena Williams returns to Wimbledon in the New Yorker, July 1st. Came out the day after Serena Williams did indeed return to Wimbledon. And I had very mixed feelings about it. We all know that Serena has had 2 children, and she had her first child before she stopped competing. Then she stopped competing, had her second child at 41. I have to tell you, these are the cutest little girls you've ever seen in your life. They were in her box, and they were just scrunchy adorable. But we've also seen Serena, of course, as a businesswoman, and as a spokesperson for, I think, Roe, or one of those companies that sells GLP-1s over the internet. And she's been on GLP-1s, and you can tell her body has changed. But her body has also changed because she's 44. And while I really wanted to see her play again, I've always been a huge Serena fan, and watching her play in person was actually one of the highlights of my life at the U.S. Open. Oh my God, she's amazing. But it was also kind of sad because Wimbledon offered her a wild card slot. She hasn't competed at all in 3 years. And as the announcers, while they were fluffing up this match, they said, not competing really puts her in a bad position. You develop a kind of edge with competition that you do not otherwise have, regardless of how hard you're practicing and how much you're working out. She was playing a 20-year-old who had lost 14 of her last 15 matches. And while arguably the match was close, Serena lost the first set. She won the second set in the tiebreaker and then lost the third set pretty easily. At 44, you're no match for someone who's 20.
Yeah.
And I kind of wondered what the point was. She kept saying that she wanted her children to see her compete. I kind of get that. She also said she wanted to feel what it was like to compete when there was nothing at stake. And she kept saying she wanted to have fun out there, which also kind of made me sad because I thought, she devoted her life to the game of tennis, and she changed the game of tennis forever. She lifted up everybody that she ever played against. And really, she wasn't enjoying herself the whole time. So that kind of made me sad. And I think it raises the whole question, and the article doesn't raise this question, but a similar piece about Madonna in today's New York Times sort of made me think, when is enough enough? I mean, with all of the things that wealthy and powerful women can do to, change their bodies, to looks max, to speak of an earlier episode we did, to health max, to body max, all of the things that they can do. And the big question in my mind is, should they? Should that slot have gone to another up-and-coming tennis player who's going to be the next Serena Williams? Not the Serena Williams who has already said goodbye to us and now is saying goodbye to us again. And as a little footnote to this, Serena and Venus are supposed to play in the doubles at Wimbledon. Venus is, I think, 46 or 47. She, too, has been hanging on the tour for all of these years. And now there's some talk that Serena might not be able to play because actually playing one singles match, she hurt herself. And so she might actually not be able to play doubles at all. So I love Serena so much. I admire her so much, and I admire everything she's accomplished. And part of me just wants to say, girl, you and I, some things are over and other things are beginning. I don't know what she's going to do to get that thrill back. And let me just add this one last thing. I had the privilege of meeting Diana Nyad many, many years ago after she had retired from Olympic swimming. And I asked her, what is it like to not be an Olympic swimmer after devoting your life to that? We were at a party. And she said, I feel dead. Which shocked the hell out of me because we were at a party and she didn't know me. But I got it. Like, when you have experienced the highs of elite competition and succeeding at elite competition, ordinary life must seem awfully tame.
Yeah. Well,
So Neil, you're going to run out there and practice your serve?
I'm going to stay in the air conditioning and find another show on Netflix to binge.
Well, I'm going to go watch the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders like now. Okay, so Neil, I'll see you next time.
See you next time.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that others can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Redemption Song, written by Bob Marley and sung by Johnny Cash and Joe Strummer. Copyrighted music, licensed from Lichty. That's all for now. See you next week.
Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We got to fulfill the book. So won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever had, redemption songs, redemption songs, redemption songs. Old pirates, yes they rob I, sold I to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took I from the bottomless pit. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Yes, some say it's just a part of it. We got to fulfill the book. So won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever had, redemption songs. All I ever had, redemption songs. These songs of freedom, songs of freedom.